I want to read it. We got an email from Desta Heliso, and I thought I'd read parts of it to you. And then I'm going to pray because Howard's too flustered to pray. Anyway, it's been a jagged day. So I think we should pray for him and his family and for Ethiopia. And we should also pray for Nigeria while we're at it and a few other places. But anyway, I was so upset by the fact that the second salon, that's the one that he was going to talk about, Hope for Africa, was going to be canceled because of me. So I thought I could push myself to prepare a Zoom presentation, not knowing that I would end up in hospital the same morning. I am now doing very well. I have been off oxygen. This is in Addis Ababa, by the way. I have been off oxygen since Wednesday afternoon. My oxygen levels are normal, coughing less and less, headaches are gone, eating and drinking well. I have been more active today. I'm being looked after so well here. I'm really impressed with the level of care despite limited resources. I feel that I'm being given a special treatment, though, with a separate room. Duty medical staff often sitting outside my room. I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Yared, the director of this hospital, for facilitating all this. He is one of those people in whom Ethiopia's hope lies. He has left his postgraduate studies in Israel halfway and came back here when he was required by the government to lead this hospital and set it up as a World Health Organization approved COVID treatment center. My family back in the UK, as you can imagine, faced my mortality. Although they knew my symptoms were only mild, the fact that I was admitted to hospital heightened their anxiety. It made it difficult for me too, because I came here before we were able to move into our newly purchased home. Joe and 4 of the kids, they have 6, had to go to Glasgow as someone had offered them their house free until we moved to our new place. The 2 boys remained in their uni accommodation. So the fact that my family were scattered all over and I was facing this wretched disease here occasionally hits me. I am hoping and praying to be back with them before that. I will have to quarantine in a hotel for 5 days. I will let you know immediately when I am negative and able to fly. Yours, Desta Heliso. So, yeah, I'm gonna cry. I can see his face. So I'd like to pray for him and his family, and also for the people of Ethiopia, for the Christians there, for the people evacuated from Lalibela. Some of you may have been there. It is the great city of the carved churches, carved out of stone in around, what year was it, in the 12th century. It was a king who happened to be in Jerusalem when Salah ad-Din recaptured Jerusalem from the Europeans who had been controlling it for off and on 100 years. And he knew that pilgrimage, Ethiopians had been making overland pilgrimage to the Holy Land kind of since Jesus. And he knew that pilgrimage would be very difficult now that the city was back in the hands of the Muslims. And so he decided he'd build his own Jerusalem in Ethiopia. And so that is what Lalibela is. And if you ever get a chance, if it's ever opened up again, which I pray to God it will be someday, it's one of the most remarkable places I've ever been in my life. And anyway, all the residents were all evacuated by the government last week because it looks like the Tigray army is going to take it over. So it's a tough time. So I'd like to pray. Lord Jesus, you know the suffering of the world. There are people in many places, if we started listing them, we'd be here all night, who are facing war, are facing poverty, are facing disease. And I pray for your grace for each of them. We know some of the people face to face, like Desta and his family, like our friend Fikru, who we don't know where he is, from Lalibela, and the other Ethiopians who we met when we were there. We pray for them that you will protect their lives and their families. We pray that you will give the people in power wisdom and help them to get over their angers, their resentments, their whatever it is. And I pray that you will bring peace, but with peace, I pray that you will bring safety and some restoration to that country. And I also pray particularly for Nigeria, where between the Fulani and the Boko Haram, people are being captured, imprisoned, and killed on a daily basis. All these things you know, and I ask in your name that you will both protect them and bring an end to the violence. I pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So, now turn the page. This is one of those really amazing things. We have a pinch hitter who's kind of a high-end pitch hitter, which is nice when you have high-end friends like all of you. So I'm reading quickly either my email or my Signal, and I get this note from Aaron Kheriaty that I see you had to cancel the salon, and we were talking about me doing my salon about bioethics, and I'm free on Saturday. And that's good because we're not paying, so it's great. So anyway, we are blessed, thankful, and so you all got the email, and here you all are. I mean, free wine and a chance to get out, but also you're going to hear a remarkable and somewhat thought-provoking talk by Aaron Carriotti, who is a psychiatrist at UC Irvine, and let me see if I can get all the things. I'm going to get it straight here, Aaron. He's a professor of psychiatry at UCI School of Medicine. He's director of the medical ethics program at UCI Health. He is chairman of the medical ethics committees at UCI Hospital and at the California Department of State Hospitals. He's a graduate of Notre Dame in philosophy and pre-med. He got his MD from Georgetown and completed his residency training at UCI, and that's frankly how we know him, because the guy he did that under is our psychiatrist. Anyway, yeah, it's a wonder, isn't it? Anyway, never mind why he thought we needed to know you. Anyway, he's written books and articles for professional and lay audiences on bioethics, social science, psychiatry, and religion. He's been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Public Discourse, and First Things. He's conducted print, radio, and television interviews on bioethics topics with the New York Times, the LA Times, CNN, Fox, and NPR. But other than that, he doesn't do much. He's also been a consultant on COVID response, ventilator triage, and vaccine allocation to the UC Office of the President, the California Department of Public Health, and the Orange County Department of Public Health. He also has a sense of humor, and he's a really good friend. And it's great to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Roberta, for the kind introduction. You read it exactly as my mother wrote it, so I appreciate that. I have to admit, I was surprised to see so many people show up tonight for the second string speaker, but then I remembered that Casey is still cooking those little appetizers, and they do serve good wine here, so then it made sense. But now you have to do your penance and sit through my talk after you had your food and drink. But seriously, thank you to Howard and Roberta for hosting this. This is probably my favorite place to give a talk, my favorite place to give a lecture, just because the ambiance and the atmosphere and the art and the people are so terrific. So I want to talk today about new technologies that are coming at us, but also think through these new technologies and new developments in terms of their implications for us as human beings. We're actually not going to talk a lot tonight about COVID. We can take a little breather from the pandemic, although I think some of the themes in tonight's talk will be at least tangentially relevant to thinking through our response to COVID, how many of the things that have been put in place may end up being permanent, and what kind of effect that might have on our lives. The technologies that I'm going to describe to you tonight, and hopefully help you to understand a little bit better, are novel in terms of thinking through prior technologies. Most of what we human beings over the millennia have developed in terms of our science and technology was developed to work on things in our environment, things in the world, to learn how to build houses, to learn how to make computers that could do wonderful calculations for us. And we've achieved marvels in that regard, from airplanes to submarines to the iPhone. The biotechnologies that we're going to look at tonight are, I think, novel in the sense that what we are working on is not just the environment out there, but we are beginning to turn science and technology back inward toward ourselves. In the striking phrase of bioethicist Leon Kass, human nature now lies on the operating table. And this raises important questions for us about what is human dignity? What does it mean? Is there a certain respect or regard that we need to have for human nature, or is human nature and human biology simply raw material that we can refashion according to our whims, our wishes, or our own view of what human beings ought to be? And these technologies, not surprisingly, as you'll see a little bit later, have caused many people to wonder whether the future for us is going to look utopian. Is it going to be a society in which we can eradicate disease and live longer and create our children according to certain specifications such that they will never cause us any more headaches? Or are we preparing for a kind of Huxleyan Brave New World where something about our use of technologies undermines our capacity to be human, right? Is there something dehumanizing about some of these proposed projects? But before we get into these novel technologies, the talk is sort of going to be broken into two parts. And we're going to do the history first, and then we're going to do the contemporary stuff second. And the history is very important, not because history necessarily repeats itself, but as Mark Twain, or at least this is attributed to Mark Twain, once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but very often it does rhyme. So the historical background that I think is of most interest in terms of thinking through some of the potential downsides or some of the potential serious ethical implications of novel biotechnologies like cloning, like gene editing, like embryo research. Before we dive into those issues, I think it's important for us to understand what happened in the last 100 or so years, not just in Germany. When I say the word eugenics, and I ask people to sort of free associate, what's the first thing that comes to mind with that word? Most students raise their hand and say the Nazis or Hitler or Germany, right? And it may come as a surprise to some of you who have some familiarity with that term that the eugenics movement didn't actually originate in Germany, and the Nazis didn't invent it. It was a movement that began late in the 19th century in Great Britain and the United States. And it was only in the 1920s and 1930s that it was later exported into Germany. So this movement is something that is kind of built into the DNA of our own history, if you will. And I believe that even though eugenics got a bad name in the wake of the Second World War with the Nuremberg trials and so forth, it sort of took a deep dive and went underground, that the ideas that were being advanced early in the 20th century with the eugenics movement are still with us today, and they're resurfacing in new ways, not exactly as they appeared 100 years ago. Remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it very often rhymes. So what is eugenics? Well, eugenics started in the late 19th century after Darwin's publication of The Origin of the Species, where many people read Darwin, latched on to this novel theory of human evolution, and said, well, if nature causes us to evolve slowly over time in sort of random ways that takes eons for any visible changes to occur, couldn't we sort of take control of that evolutionary process in some way? So Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin, is credited with coining the term eugenics, and he described it as follows: what nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, that is to say, evolution by natural selection, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly. And thus was the birth of eugenics. Eugenics ideas took off in the United States, these ideas of controlling breeding, either by encouraging the right kind of people to have more babies, so-called positive eugenics, and by discouraging, sometimes using force if necessary, the quote-unquote wrong kind of people from reproducing, which led, as we'll see in a few minutes, to the involuntary sterilization of tens of thousands of Americans. This is the, sorry, my screen is not synced here. This is the logo of an international eugenics conference that occurred in 1921. And although we can look back and in retrospect understand many of the ideas of these eugenicists to be a kind of pseudoscience based on a crude understanding of biology and a crude understanding of how diseases and traits are actually inherited, at the time, it's important to remember that eugenics was not seen as a pseudoscience. It was put forward by credible authorities as scientific. And in fact, here, eugenics is portrayed as a kind of master science where all these other sciences, and you probably can't read this in the back, but we have biology and genetics and psychology and anthropology and statistics and all kinds of other branches of the human and social sciences feeding into this big trunk that we call eugenics, that brings all of these disparate sciences together into one science of making life better for human beings. That's the idea. Like a tree, this says eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. The eugenics movement in the United States was not peripheral. It was not fringe. It was mainstream, with funding from mainstream foundations, the largest foundations in the United States, with intellectual support and public credibility given by Ivy League professors, including the founder of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, who was the first chair of the American Breeders Association. And you might be forgiven for thinking that the American Breeders Association was about dogs and horses. No, they were talking about breeding human beings here. He also was the author of a racist book called The Blood of the Nation. The politicians and other social influencers were also throwing their weight behind eugenics, including both of the Roosevelt presidents. Here we have a quote from FDR, right, about keeping the wrong kind of people out of the country. So increasing scholarship in the last few years has shown that, that Roosevelt was a sort of quiet eugenicist, promoting and considering all kinds of projects to keep the wrong kind of folks out of America or to help them to leave after the Second World War. If I mention the word Dred Scott, that will conjure, for many people who have studied American history, a famous Supreme Court case. Or if I mention Roe versus Wade, many, perhaps even most Americans understand, well, that was a Supreme Court case. I think it had something to do with abortion. So there are these well-known court cases that make their way into even high school curricula of American history. If I say the word or the name Buck v. Bell, how many of you have heard of this case before, or read about it before? I imagine some of you have, but many Americans haven't. And to my mind, this should be one of the most famous or infamous Supreme Court cases, analogous to the Dred Scott case. So this is a case in 1927 of a young woman named Carrie Buck, who lived in Virginia, and the state of Virginia had passed a law permitting the involuntary sterilization of mentally disabled individuals. She was diagnosed with a condition known as congenital feeble-mindedness, and if you're wondering what congenital feeble-mindedness was, the category was just about as hazy in 1927 as it would be today if you were to diagnose someone with something like that. She was accused of being sexually promiscuous. In fact, she had gotten pregnant because she was raped by her uncle, but never mind. She was poor, and she was pregnant at a very young age, and she was uneducated, hence the feeble-mindedness diagnosis. And therefore, the state of Virginia was going to sterilize her over against her objections. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the court decided in favor of the state of Virginia over against the claims of Carrie Buck. Later on, her sister, at the age of 13, was involuntarily sterilized also by the state of Virginia. Her sister was told at the time that she was going into the hospital for an appendectomy, removal of her appendix, and they did a tubal ligation instead. In a Supreme Court case that has never officially been overturned by the court, now the law on which the case rested, the state law on which the case rested, has been overturned by the legislature, has been legislated out of law. The court case has never been officially overturned. The famous American jurist, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., writing for the majority, said that the principle that allows for forced vaccination is, quote, broad enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. And then comes the famous or infamous line, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. U.S. Supreme Court case, 1927. 33 states passed laws between about 1910 and the last of these laws was taken off the books around the 1960s, in some states on even into the 1970s. Under these laws, 65,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized. Most of them were diagnosed with a physical or mental health condition that would have been considered at the time some form of disability. But if you look at the actual demographic characteristics of the folks who were involuntarily sterilized, it wasn't the disabled child coming from a well-to-do family most of the time. It was the poor, it was the minorities, it was those who were sort of at the bottom of the socioeconomic or social strata that ended up subjected to these laws, which also had strong racial or racialized overtones. You see here headlines describing the need to preserve racial integrity, so we have to maintain the laws against interracial marriage. On the right, you have a sort of pseudo-scientific, quasi-scientific description of traits that can be seen in the shape of the face or in the shape of the head that would indicate genetic or inherited tendencies towards criminality or civil insanity. California played an outsized role in these forced sterilizations. So this project was pioneered right here in our home state. If you remember the number I mentioned on the last slide, 65,000, and then you look at this number, you'll see that about 1/3 of all the involuntary sterilizations in the entire country were done here in California. Women were sterilized at 3 times the rate of men, even though a vasectomy is a much less medically risky procedure, much less invasive than a tubal ligation. About 1/3 of them were diagnosed supposedly with some form of intellectual or cognitive impairment, though again, feeble-mindedness of the uneducated was a common diagnosis. And about 2/3 had some sort of physical disability. Blacks were disproportionately represented among the sterilizations as compared to their overall prevalence in the populations, as were Mexican Americans. So you see, again, the sort of racialized effects, at least, and overtones of much of the eugenics propaganda. California's last forced sterilization occurred in 1983. Wow. Thanks for the shout out. Was that David?
Sorry, I missed our appointment the other day.
Awesome.
We are too.
So the next step in this process, in 1911, the Carnegie Foundation funded a study Remember the American Breeders Association? The founding president of Stanford University was the first chair of this. So the Carnegie Foundation funded a study that delivered a report on, quote, the best practical means for cutting off the defective germ plasm in the human population. So genes hadn't been discovered in 1911. So this notion of germ plasm, this was whatever it is that isn't inherited from parents to children. And recommendation number 8 of the report. I'm getting a lot of shrieks during this talk from the Amundsen, so I think that's a good thing. Eugenics was not a Nazi invention. Eugenics was an American export to Germany. The ideas were percolating here starting in the early 20th century. The Germans took it to the next level. Hoch and Bidding, a psychiatrist and a lawyer, published a book, very influential book in 1923 in Germany, advocating the destruction of Lebenswertes Leben, which roughly translates life unworthy of life. The German medical establishment embraced this notion before the Nazis came to power, during the Weimar Republic. In 1933, the Nazis passed their own eugenic sterilization laws, and in a country that had a very small population compared to the United States, they very quickly, in the span of only 5 years, forcibly sterilized over 350,000 people. So they became very, very efficient at doing what we had already done here in the United States. Most of these forced sterilizations, by the way, had to be signed off by a physician. Most of the physicians signing off on these were psychiatrists, right? The ones diagnosing individuals with schizophrenia and manic depression and alcoholism and epilepsy and these kinds of neuropsychiatric problems for which many, many individuals were sterilized. The Nazis took it a step further in 1939 with the launch of the Nazi T4 program. This was their involuntary euthanasia of the mentally unfit program, where individuals, with the permission of their own physicians, who had to, again, sign off on them, physicians were the gatekeepers of this project, were involuntarily euthanized. They were killed without their knowledge, without their family's knowledge. In many cases, they would lie about the cause of death. The first gas chambers in Germany were not in concentration camps. The first gas chambers in Germany were in hospitals, specifically in psychiatric hospitals. The first people gassed by the Nazis were not Jews or other ethnic minorities. That came later, and it happened on, obviously, an enormous scale that all of us are familiar with. But the first individuals who were gassed under the Nazi regime were mentally ill individuals, done with the cooperation of the German medical establishment, with ideas that had not been proposed first by the Nazis, but had been proposed in Germany first by physicians, following the lead of many physicians in the United States. 45% of physicians in Germany became members of the Nazi Party. Membership in the party was not a requirement for licensure in Germany. It could help you advance in academic medicine, but it certainly wasn't required. Compare that number to only 10% of teachers in Germany who became members of the Nazi Party. And it gives you a sense that this ideology took hold of science and medicine in ways that preceded this ideology taking hold politically and in the larger society. So much for history. I want to talk about some of the new technologies on the horizon, and then get back to this question about whether these new technologies raise the possibility of new forms of eugenics. Probably not state-controlled eugenics, perhaps a kind of consumer-driven eugenics that's occurring on a case-by-case basis, but nonetheless that can have large-scale social consequences. So let's start with a technology that's already with us, that's deployed in wide use already, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And as with any of these technologies that raise profound moral and human questions, this technology was put forward with good intentions and originally proposed as a way to eliminate genetic diseases. And who doesn't want to eliminate genetic diseases? Seems like a good idea. So this combines the technologies of IVF, creating an embryo from sperm and eggs in a lab, and then implanting it into the uterus, but also our ability now to take a few cells out of that embryo at the blastocyst stage, a very early stage of development, and test that embryo for genetic diseases and actually sequence the entire genome of the baby. So parents who may be at risk of passing on a genetic disease to their child may want to have a child this way rather than in the old-fashioned way to avoid having a child that's also afflicted by that genetic disorder. I think it's important to note, however, that this does not actually treat any genetic diseases. This doesn't take a human embryo or human organism that is afflicted by a disease and intervene in order to fix the disease. This simply discards whatever embryos may be affected and selects the ones that are more fit to be brought to birth. That's the idea. And today, it's well known, widely known in medicine that this is often used for sex selection. I want a baby boy or baby girl. And as our knowledge of the complex relationship between genes and complex traits develops, right? Many people have proposed, some with enthusiasm, like Hank Greeley at Stanford has written a book called The End of Sex and the Future of Reproduction. And he argues that in 20 years, nobody, at least no one with the means, will be having babies the old-fashioned way. They'll be doing this combined with gene editing to get the kind of children that they want. But in the future, it's not difficult to see how this may be used, not just to select for sex, not just to select against genetic diseases, but to select for other traits that can be measured genetically. Another technology that's in the process of being developed is IVG, which is different from IVF. What is done here is that stem cells, either adult stem cells or embryonic stem cells, are programmed to basically become gametes. What's a gamete? Gamete is sperm or eggs. So in 2018, the first human egg was extracted from a woman. The first human egg cells were created in a lab from adult stem cells that were taken from a grown person. So what's the issue with this? Well, one of the challenges with what we talked about in the last slide, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, is that typically only a small handful of embryos can be created with a round of IVF. IVF is very difficult on a woman's body. You have to hyperstimulate the ovaries to produce eggs. There's an invasive procedure to harvest those eggs that is risky, sometimes complicated. It's difficult to go through this, and usually you only get a few embryos to so to speak, choose from. But if you can take skin cells or cells from the inside of the mouth or wherever from an adult and program them to become eggs, it becomes possible to create potentially hundreds of embryos in a lab without an invasive procedure. Sperm is much easier to come by than eggs, right? So that's not the rate-limiting step in this project. So the idea of a kind of commercial eugenics or embryo farming, where you literally have hundreds of different embryos to choose from in a lab, becomes possible. Also, some other bizarre and unusual possibilities become possible with this. So, you can imagine the maid at the hotel where Brad Pitt was staying last night goes and takes some cells that have sloughed off on his pillow and reprograms his cells to become gametes and has his child, right, in a lab. Well, this seems sort of far-fetched and fantastic, but theoretically and biologically, this kind of thing may become possible. Another possibility, eggs derived from men and sperm derived from women, which is of interest to many people for reasons that you can imagine. A third possibility would be to take stem cells from an embryo that you've created in a lab, extract those stem cells from an embryo and create sperm and eggs, from which you create another embryo, from which you extract embryonic stem cells. And you do this cycle several times in a row. And then finally, you end up with an embryo that you decide you're going to bring to birth. That embryo that you've brought to birth, curiously, has no living relatives that are genetically related to him or her, because that embryo's genetic parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, perhaps great-great-grandparents were all embryos that were created and destroyed in a lab. What does this do to notions of lineage and identity, right, when we start intervening in the process of biological reproduction in this way? All of us have heard of human cloning. We might remember back to Dolly the sheep. Cloning of human embryos is possible now and has been done, although none of those cloned human embryos have been brought to birth. Many scientists and bioethicists are interested in permitting cloning for the purpose of research. Most people are still very wary of the idea of cloning in order to produce children, right? We can imagine these kind of very worrisome scenarios about, even if we clone people that we consider to be really wonderful and good, right? If we clone LeBron James, what kind of expectations are going to be placed on that child? What happens if it just turns out that he doesn't like basketball? Is everyone going to be disappointed, right? And then there's the dystopian nightmare scenarios about somebody cloning Osama bin Laden, as though that child would automatically become a terrorist, like, I was going to say like his father, but I don't know if that's right. Genetic engineering is something that bioethicists have talked about for a long time, at least 50 years. But it's only been in the last few years where this technology becomes really usable and really feasible to actually go in and delete a gene at a specific spot and insert another gene exactly where you want it. And that became possible with a new technology called CRISPR, clustered regularly interspersed short palindromic repeats, which will be on the exam. The CRISPR system is derived from bacteria, actually. Bacteria have to defend themselves against viruses. And it was discovered in some bacteria that they had this set of scissors that they could use to chop up viral DNA. And once we figured out how to use that, we could chop up other DNA as well, the DNA of plants and animals and even human beings. And so this opens up the possibility of genetically engineered plants and foods with a technology known as gene drive, where you can push new genetic changes through a rapidly reproducing population quickly. People have proposed projects like wiping out the species of mosquito most responsible for spreading malaria in order to get rid of malaria. Don't get me wrong. I'm the first person who would want to see the end of malaria. And I'm not really very fond of mosquitoes. But at the same time, I know enough about ecology and the delicate balance of ecology in the natural world that I'm not sure we should set about with these kinds of projects of wiping out entire species simply because they're inconvenient for us. But of course, the real debates and the real worries and the real excitement about gene editing comes when we talk about editing the genes of human beings. And a couple of distinctions can be helpful here in thinking about the different ways that this can be used. Gene editing can be used to cure genetic diseases for individuals. That would be using it in a therapeutic way and in a somatic way. What I mean by somatic is you take someone that has leukemia, you take out their bone marrow, you reprogram some of their white blood cells or the stem cells that make white blood cells to attack their cancer. And then you transplant those genetically altered bone marrow stem cells back into the individual to cure the cancer. That technology is already with us. It's been FDA approved. It's very exciting and wonderful. The ethics of thinking through how to use that kind of technology are more or less the same as the ethics of using other medical advances like a new medication. Is it safe? Is it effective? Have we gotten informed consent from the individual that is receiving this, right? So nothing very novel there, although some really cool developments on the horizon. Where it gets more complicated is when we start talking about using gene editing not to take sick people and make them well, that would be a therapeutic application, but to take well people, healthy people, and make them quote unquote better than well, right? Bigger, faster, stronger, smarter. The other place where this becomes very complicated very quickly is the idea of changing DNA at the level of the germline, meaning altering the DNA not just of one individual, but altering the DNA either of an embryo or altering the DNA in someone's sperm and eggs. What's the difference? Well, if I alter the DNA of an embryo, that embryo is brought to birth, eventually that change that I've introduced is going to impact that individual's gametes, that individual's own sperm and egg, and that change will therefore be passed on to their offspring, and to that offspring's offspring, on down through the generation. So when we're talking about germline gene edits, we're talking about, gee, if we make a mistake here, or if something goes wrong, or if there are unintended consequences, it won't just impact that one individual who was informed of the risks and willing to take those risks for himself to try to get a cure for his cancer or whatever, or even to try to get bigger, faster, stronger. But those are changes, and maybe deleterious, maybe detrimental changes that will be passed on to that individual's offspring on down through the generations. So we're sort of introducing the idea of affecting subsequent generations on down the line, and generations of people who cannot provide informed consent, who may not have wanted these kinds of novel changes to be deployed on them. Germline gene editing is currently prohibited in 40 countries. Interestingly, it's not prohibited here in the United States, although it is not federally funded. The current scientific consensus is that it should be okay to do this as long as you don't bring any of the embryos to birth. And it's an interesting ethical consensus in the sense that it not just permits, but requires the destruction of human life at its embryonic stage whenever you're proposing to do this. In 2015, Chinese researchers used CRISPR to genetically modify the first human embryo, and you may have seen in the headlines a few years ago in 2018 that a Chinese researcher who's currently languishing in a Chinese prison because he embarrassed the Chinese Communist Party by getting out ahead of the consensus on this. But in any case, John Kia, a scientist who had trained at Stanford, went back to China, brought twin girls to birth. Well, he didn't bring them to birth. He genetically altered them at the embryonic stage. Then they were implanted and brought to birth, presumably still alive today. He had introduced a gene that presumably made them more resilient to infection with HIV. So interestingly, the first germline gene editing project on a human being who was brought to birth was not treatment of a disease, but it was a kind of enhancement of that individual's immune system. So we sort of jumped right over the less ethically controversial application of this technology and went right toward the more controversial application. Now, with the possibility of gene editing now in ways that are much more precise, much faster, much cheaper than they were 10 or even 5 years ago, interest in human cloning has once again resurfaced. Now, if most people are not in favor of cloning to produce children, and we're going to clone embryos and destroy them in a lab, why is there this felt need for human cloning? Well, here's why. With gene editing, many scientists want to disable or knock out a gene in an embryo to figure out what role that gene plays in that embryo's development. What is it that this gene does that allows an embryo to develop? Maybe this gene has something to do with the development of the embryo's kidneys or brain or whatever. Well, that would be a scientific experiment on a human being in its earliest stage of development. And any good scientific experiment ideally would have a matched control. And the perfect matched control would be another little embryo that shared the exact same genes. How do you get two embryos that share the exact same genes when you create them in a lab? Well, you clone them. So the gene editing technology development that has occurred since CRISPR has once again pushed people back into the claim that we now need human cloning, at least human cloning of embryos, in order to reap all the benefits of the scientific knowledge that we're going to gain from gene editing research on human embryos. Not sure if you've ever heard of these mammals, the human-animal chimera. Most of this research, where it's being done in the United States, is being done here in California. The reason is it's not federally funded, but it is funded by the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. That money that we approved several years ago in the statewide proposition, I think it was re-upped last year in the recent election. So there's state funding for research that would allow us to create animals that are not a blend of two different species in the sense of like a mule. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about animals that have different parts that are different species. Now, why would we want to do this? Most of the push to allow us to create human-animal chimeras comes from this proposal to grow human organs for purposes of transplantation inside other animals, like grow human kidneys inside of a pig. So you take a pig embryo, you knock out the genes with CRISPR or whatever that we think are responsible for the development of the pig's kidneys. You then take some adult stem cells from the individual who needs that kidney, and you inject those into the pig embryo with the hopes that those will grow as a kind of replacement part into the missing organ. Then you grow the pig to a certain stage of development. You kill the pig, you take out the human kidney inside the pig, and it's a perfect match for the individual who donated those adult stem cells and who needs the organ. Interesting proposal. But as you can imagine, there's some wrinkles here. The biggest wrinkle is that our knowledge of embryonic and mammalian development is so primitive that we're monkeying with an extremely complex system. And we don't really exactly know what's going to happen when we put human stem cells inside of the embryo of another mammal. Are those going to contribute only and exclusively to the development of the kidneys? Or are they also going to contribute to the development of the central nervous system? Are we going to grow a pig that has a human-like or a humanoid brain that is capable of higher cognition? Is Animal Farm going to become a literal reality? So the chimeras were in the news recently, about a year ago. And then a few months after that, I saw this television show being advertised on Netflix. And I couldn't help think that it was maybe more than just a coincidence. All right, final piece of technology before we wrap up here. The green, so this is a human cell. The green stuff you see in here is a small organelle in the cell called the mitochondria. The mitochondria are sort of the engine of the cell. That's what gives our cells energy. Now, if you know anything about genetics, you know that most of our DNA, most of our chromosomes, which contain most of our DNA, is located in the nucleus of the cell. And that's what's passed on to our offspring when we reproduce. At least one copy of the pair is passed on from the mother and the father. But there is some DNA also located in these little green, well, they're not actually green. These were stained green. In these little mitochondria. Right? Why is this DNA important? Well, when this DNA is not working right, it can actually cause severe illnesses called mitochondrial disorders. And as a way of trying to avoid passing on a mitochondrial disorder to one's child, these so-called mitochondrial replacement techniques have been developed. So all of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother. That's because it's located in the egg, but not in the sperm. Right? The egg is like a larger cell that has some of the mitochondria in it. So mitochondrial replacement techniques would take the DNA in the nucleus of the intended mother's cell, take a donor egg from someone else, remove the nucleus from that donor egg, and put in the intended mother's nucleus. So there you have an egg that has mitochondrial DNA from one woman and nuclear DNA from another woman. You then fertilize it with sperm, bring it to birth, and you end up with a child that has 3 genetic parents. In 2017, a scientist physician in the United States announced that he had created a child using this technique. He went down and did this in Mexico to avoid, regulatory red tape here in the United States. And recently, the National Academy of Sciences in the United States recommended approving this, but only for creating or bringing to birth male children. Why male children? Well, if something goes wrong with this, and there's problems because of all this tinkering at the genetic level, at least the male child will not pass on those problems to his offspring, because none of the mitochondrial DNA in his children will come from him, they'll come from the mother. So this was seen as sort of a cautious approach to moving forward with these kinds of technologies. No one is really asking the questions, what might it be like for a child born that is genetically related to 3 different people? Those questions are among the ethical considerations that rarely get a whole lot of attention. So just in closing, we certainly don't have time to explore all the profound ethical implications of these technologies, but I just want to gesture toward a few issues. So whenever I give this lecture, I describe these technologies to people, very often the initial response is a kind of, ew. It strikes us as very odd, very strange, very foreign to the experience of human beings from the beginning of time. Leon Kass, who I cited at the beginning of the article, wrote an essay on human cloning titled "The Wisdom of Repugnance," where he wanted to argue that the kind of moral intuitions that are expressed in this initial revulsion might be meaningful and might be something that we want to pay attention to. But as these technologies start getting used more and more, the problem is that we get used to things that perhaps we shouldn't get used to anymore. Dostoevsky described this very famously in his novel Crime and Punishment. So is there some wisdom in that initial reaction that most people have to the idea of human cloning that just says, I don't know if I can articulate what exactly is wrong with this, but it just feels wrong to me. And those sentiments are ridiculed and derided by many bioethicists. And that's not rational, that's just kind of prejudice and bias, and you're probably genetically programmed to feel that way, but it's not really meaningful. But I'm sympathetic to this notion that there may be a kind of tacit knowledge that people are expressing there, that even if they can't put it into a knockdown, drag-out argument, may be expressing something important about our humanity. So I mentioned the possibility of a new eugenics that's probably not going to be state-mandated, government-driven, dictating who can and who can't reproduce and what kind of genetic traits we want to cultivate in the population and which ones we want to weed out and so forth. But all of this may still be operating on a case-by-case basis at the individual level, right? If you have ever seen the movie Gattaca, where mom and dad go into the clinic and they're doing the genetic testing to, asking them which traits they sort of want to select for, and they go through a list of, blonde hair versus brown hair, blue eyes versus brown eyes, and after a while, the mom sort of sits back and says, well, aren't there some things that we should sort of, leave up to chance, right? Expressing this intuition that controlling the process of procreation in this way may not be the best or wisest way to proceed. When we're using these technologies to create the kind of children that we want, or to manipulate nascent human life so that we can experiment on it and then discard it, is that shifting our attitude toward the human beings that we create and or the human beings that we create and bring to birth? Is a new child a gift, a surprise? Or is it a product of our rational will that we have made according to a certain set of specifications? It's interesting to notice the shift in language that's occurred really since the 1970s, where some of these assisted reproductive technologies started getting underway. The first IVF baby was created in 1978, Louise Brown. We used to, in the old days, talk about procreation. And if you break that word down, you see that there's an element of mystery to it. There's an element of cooperating with something transcendent or higher, right? It's a religious, or at least it gestures toward a religious understanding of bringing new life into the world. Now we talk about reproduction, which is a term derived from manufacturing. I think another interesting way to start reflecting on and thinking about these technologies is by drawing analogies from what we've learned about complex systems from environmental ecology, right? That we now know that the world out there is complex and beautiful and delicate, and actually when we start tinkering with it in certain ways, oftentimes there are downstream consequences that will have profound impacts on the future of society, the future of human beings, and that certain things that we do may be such that it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle later on when we wake up and realize the effects of what we've done. And I think this kind of approach that has regard for nature, doesn't just see nature as a set of raw material to be exploited or consumed or manipulated in particular ways, but that has its own integrity that needs at least some degree of regard and respect. Well, doesn't it make sense to apply some of those lessons to human nature as well, to think about these bioethics questions, not just at the individual level of what might this do to the parent's attitude toward their own child, but what kind of effects do these individual decisions have on a larger scale? And one example that shows up here is the issue of sex-selective abortion in China and India. China and India don't mandate, although there are certainly pressures and inducements politically and socially against having baby girls, but it's not mandated in the way that the old eugenics was, that you must have more boys than girls. And yet, individuals make those individual choices one at a time, but in the aggregate, demographers now know that the male to female ratio in these countries has become so skewed that we're starting to see adverse social consequences of having too many men as compared to women, with increases in aggression and violence and all the things that happen when there are not enough mates. So, I mean, this is an interesting example too, because I remember this came up in a bioethics discussion with medical students, and this caused some cognitive dissonance for one of the students who said, I'm a progressive kind of radical feminist. So I'm supposed to believe that somebody should be able to have an abortion for any reason that they want. The doctor shouldn't ask any questions. But no, I'm troubled by this idea that they would abort the child simply because it was a girl, because I'm also a feminist, and I think that's kind of discriminatory. And so, all that to say, if we only look at these questions on a case-by-case basis, and we don't sort of Google Earth up and look at the broad social consequences, we're not going to get the full picture of the implications of this. Gene editing has also been proposed. This is a whole area of research in terms of the possibility of expanding the human lifespan considerably, right? Maybe doubling the human lifespan. Maybe in 50 years, human beings, if we tinker with the telomeres and the other things on our genes that cause senescence and aging, maybe we can live to be 150, right? And you might think, that sounds pretty good. I personally do not want to live to 150, but a lot of folks think that sounds like a really neat idea. But of course, if human beings live to 150, that's going to have profound impacts, not just on those individuals, but on all of society. It's going to have, just to mention one example among many, assuming that a human generation is roughly 30 years, if you were to live to 150, you could survive to see great, 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 great grandchildren. And that great, 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 great grandchild would have how many great, 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 great grandparents still living? 64. You can do the math. Interesting, isn't it? Right? So maybe some of us were fortunate enough to be alive and meet our great-grandparents. I was, and that was wonderful. And I could meet all of them, and I could get to know all of them before they passed away. I certainly was able to become very close to my own grandparents. But if I had 64 of these people hanging around, what would that do to my sense of belonging and lineage and connection to my family? So anyway, many different implications of these technologies that go beyond, gee, I'd like another 50 years on the planet. So many of you have heard this, this remark that came from the philosopher George Santayana. I mentioned Mark Twain's quip at the beginning. I think the historical perspective that we opened with hopefully raises questions for us about not just the good and promising possibilities of these new technologies to cure disease or to make life better, but also some of the dangers that may lie ahead if we don't approach these things with wisdom and humility. So with that, we'll wrap up, and if there's time, I'm happy to take questions.
This is a more pertinent, how should I say, current problem on bioethics. You know, early on with this COVID virus hitting, people were dying. And as the pathologists were doing their autopsies, they came to the conclusion that these people were dying from oxygen starvation. And they coined a term, cytokine storms. Well, a cytokine is an inflammatory chemical produced by your immune system. They weren't dying of overwhelming viruses.
Right.
The virus had triggered an abnormal response in the air cells, in the air sacs in our lungs. It was an autoimmune phenomenon. You don't hear about this anymore. There's another thing that needs clarification. Early on, it was noted that a drug called Plaquenil, or hydroxychloroquine, had a calming effect on autoimmune diseases. As a matter of fact, people were using Plaquenil every day of their lives for 3 decades that calmed the immune system down. Now, in May of 2019, the Wall Street Journal reported that over 150 million people had their medical records hacked, and they used it for ransomware.
Yeah.
Also, we had known, as I said before, hydroxychloroquine had been used for decades safely to calm down autoimmune phenomena. If criminals could hack medical records for ransomware, how many people that have been taking hydroxychloroquine every day of their lives for, let's say, 3 decades have been admitted to hospitals, ICUs, or for that matter, have died? You can't get that information. Our government has shut that down. It's not available. You talk about bioethics. What in heaven's name is going on with our government?
So these technologies are not, they don't exist in a vacuum. The scientific institutions that are developing these technologies do not exist in a vacuum. They have complex and sometimes problematic relationship to capitalist society and large institutions that stand to profit from these technologies. So that's one issue. They have a complex relationship also with the government agencies like the NIH that fund these technologies. And they have a complex, and some would even argue sometimes incestuous relationship with the regulatory agencies that give the thumbs up or the thumbs down, or that make policy in regards to these technologies. And I think if our response to COVID has done anything, it's caused many Americans to ask precisely the kind of questions that you are asking. Why were electronic medical records developed and pushed? I can tell you as a physician, the push did not come from physicians. Physicians feel like glorified data entry clerks because medical records used to be physicians communicating with ourselves and with one another, right? I wrote down in the chart something I wanted to remember later. Now I document, not for that purpose, but I document for the purpose of putting down all the information that the third-party payer wants or that the medical system, the hospital system wants, so that they can query that information later. So there are very large shifts in medicine and in biotechnology. The response to COVID, without getting down into the weeds and getting down into many of the controversies about repurposed drugs and vaccines and so forth, in my view, there's been a strong push to suppress interventions that will not stand to make a lot of money. And there has been a strong push to also suppress non-medical solutions to the COVID problem. So, I mean, how many public health officials have gotten up and talked about strengthening your immune system rather than just avoiding someone who might contaminate you with a virus? There's lots of ways to do that. Sitting at home in front of a screen is not a good way to do that, by the way. We're not hearing those approaches, right? So who benefits? How is the money flowing? How is the power related to that money? You don't have to be a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist to be very confused about what's going on now and to want answers that you're not being given. I think it's very, very important to say that. It's also important for us to really ask what is the place of safety, health, and biosecurity in a flourishing life as a whole, right? I mean, hopefully you have asked yourself the question at this point in the pandemic, where is my threshold? What freedoms, what human activities, what face-to-face encounters would I refuse to give up if I was told to? If the answer is, I don't know, I think you should reflect carefully on that question. If there are no limits to what you would be willing to give up to avoid getting infected with this virus, I think you should reflect carefully on that question, because you will be giving up a lot of things that are humanly important, a lot of humanly important goods for the sake of a statistical nudge to your safety. I'm not here to tell you what to do in that regard. What treatments to pursue, what preventive measures to pursue. I think people should make their own decisions in that regard. I think there should be a lot less top-down command and control in that regard. But I think that's an important question for all of us to ask.
I have two things. one of our ex-presidents stated that politicians are like diapers. They need to be changed frequently for the same reason.
Well, there is a recall election coming up. Are there other? I want to give other folks a chance to ask any questions if they have any too.
One other question, then I'll let
real
the
quick.
microphone go. With these variants of the COVID virus
Yeah.
that are ramping up and people are recovering,
Yeah.
when they recover, is their immune system
Yes. Thank you for asking that question.
So the question is, why are they not indicating that the majority of these people with the new variant that recover have the equivalence of possibly vaccination?
Yeah. The most strongly suppressed and ignored truth is the reality of natural immunity in COVID recovered individuals. I'm one of them. I've recovered from COVID. My whole family's recovered from COVID. My immunity is better than anyone who's been vaccinated, and there's robust scientific evidence to that effect. My immunity against Delta and Lambda is every bit as good as it was against the wild type original strain, so far as we can tell. That might change in the future, right? But the natural immunity that our body produces is more robust and more durable than any immunity that you can get from a vaccine. That's not to downplay the vaccines or to critique them. It's just to say that's not something that most Americans have been told. Right? Individuals who have had COVID and recovered, whether it's one of the new variants or whether it's the original variant, don't need to walk around worrying about reinfection. They don't need to walk around worrying about transmission. If we were to admit that, and if we were actually to do population-based random testing to find out just how many Americans have had COVID, it's amazing that this far into the pandemic, we don't know the answer to that question. Has that occurred to you? Incidence and prevalence, the two most basic metrics in epidemiology for any illness. How many people have had it, and how many new people are getting it in a given period of time. Incidence and prevalence in the population. We don't have those numbers for COVID. It's been estimated somewhere around 30% of people have had COVID, maybe 50% of the people have had COVID. We don't know for sure, but that's 30% or 50% of the profits away from the vaccine manufacturers. If those people don't actually need a vaccine and don't actually need boosters. Pfizer's vaccine contract with Israel, very small country, was it the size of New Jersey or something? $3 billion just for one manufacturer's sales of vaccine to one country. So there's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of money at stake in what kind of response we mount to this pandemic. Keep that in mind when you're being presented with information. Mal.
So, I was a kid growing up in New York, and thank you. I'm a recovering engineer, so I think that way. As a kid growing up in New York, I played in the sewers. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's
why not?
That was fun in Harlem. Okay. Taking samples of sewage can tell us in community after community after community how prevalent the disease is.
Yeah.
My wife is a recovering public health nurse.
And they've actually started. They've started very recently to do this.
Yeah. We
with COVID.
talked about it with in a different venue, but that's so incredibly cheap and productive, and then public health expenditures can be directed in the places where they are most needed.
Rather than asymptomatic testing every four days, where the more you test, the more, if you only have 2% false positives and you test 1,000 people, you can live with that. 2% false positive and you're doing millions of tests, that number gets pretty big pretty quickly. So, yeah. Don't test unless you know what you're looking for and you have a reason to test. So these basic principles of epidemiology and public health and medicine, it's like the playbook was just totally thrown out during this pandemic. It's been surreal for me to watch as a physician. I've never seen anything like it. It's very troubling.
Aaron, thank you for an excellent presentation. I've had a lot of physician friends, and I like your comments at the beginning about, are we leading to a utopian, or you kind of use the word dehumanizing, and kind of dystopian? And specifically about the medical community, a lot of friends will say, I don't know who to trust.
Yeah.
Right? The medical community, we know politics has kind of seeped in, and we've got passport vaccines,
Yeah.
and we got questions about having our young children going to college, having to get vaccinated. So do you see, being in the middle of the medical community, a move towards the moral intuitions rising up and standing up and saying, hold on, you're one of the few voices, but there's a lot of head dropping and hiding.
I wish I was seeing more of that. What I'm seeing is a lot of physicians and scientists and epidemiologists quietly and privately behind the scenes voicing dissenting opinions against the dominant narratives. But they're afraid to speak out. They're afraid to be silenced. They're afraid to be accused of liability for deaths if they tell someone don't worry and they take risks and they get infected. So again, I've never seen anything like it in medicine where physicians and medical scientists are so nervous about saying what they actually think publicly. They're willing maybe to say it privately with people they know and trust, but this is not a salutary trend. We don't want people to be behaving in this way. I've puzzled over the whole lack of acknowledgement for natural immunity. I think money has something to do with it, but I think there's a disposition and an attitude as well. I'm going to put on my psychiatrist hat for a minute that has something else to do with it. One of it is just a lack of regard for the beauty of the created order, right? That our bodies actually work better. And medicine is about facilitating what is there, right? When you take an antibiotic, the antibiotic does not actually get rid of the infection. What do you mean it doesn't get rid of the infection? The antibiotic suppresses the replication of the bacteria sufficiently that your immune system eradicates the infection. Your immune system does the work. The antibiotic just helps your immune system to do what it needs to do when it's overwhelmed. If somebody is immunocompromised, if their immune system is not functioning, you can give them all the antibiotics in the world and they won't get well. That's why so many people died of AIDS. That's what happened with AIDS. It destroyed the immune system. So it's a lack of regard for that, but it's also in our kind of technocratic society where we want to believe that we and our ingenuity and our science and our powers are in control. The virus was a kind of affront to that hubris, right? And so I think there's a strong felt need for us with our technology to conquer this virus. Rather than many people get sick, most people recover. The people who recover are now part of the solution rather than part of the risk. And, in some sense, most of what is happening is outside of our control. Right? Our society does not want to admit that that is the case. Most of what we've done has not helped or it's made the problem worse. That is an affront to this attitude that we need to be the ones to fix this in order to reassert our control. No, you can't control the natural world. We don't have complete control, even over our own biology. And
philosophy in a nutshell, my economics in a nutshell.
Make your next appointment.
Doug.
Thank you. Aaron, how reflective or not is the bioethics community? What I mean by that is, how would we expect to collectively come to a decision of what is right and what is wrong if we don't even agree on what it means for something to be right and wrong? And is that something that they talk about, or is that the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about?
It's the elephant in the room that most mainstream bioethicists do not want to talk about. I mean, just look at the response of mainstream bioethics to the COVID pandemic. How many dissenting voices have we heard from ethicists saying, no, you can't discharge all the patients from your practice who are unvaccinated simply because they're unvaccinated. You can't refuse to see them simply because they made a medical choice that you disagree with. Right? I haven't seen very many medical ethicists standing up and saying, this is wrong, this contradicts your oath, this contradicts basic principles of bioethics. I have not seen a lot of medical ethicists standing up and saying, no, this coercive approach violates basic principles like informed consent that go all the way back to the Nuremberg Code in the 1940s and the Helsinki Declaration that was promulgated by the World Medical Association in the 1960s and the Belmont Report in the 1970s in the United States. I mean, the central principle of bioethics is being steamrolled and trammeled by many of these policies, and I'm not hearing very much of anything from my colleagues in bioethics. So I don't think the institution of professional bioethics is any more equipped to handle the serious problems raised by either the pandemic or novel biotechnologies, any more than our public institutions have been well equipped to handle the pandemic. This all sounds very pessimistic, and I didn't mean to get everyone so depressed tonight. There's some cool stuff on the horizon too. I mean, I'm a physician. I love medicine. I love science. So yeah, this talk is a little bit cautionary, I guess, and I don't necessarily want to leave us on a pessimistic note. We are going to get through the pandemic, but we should also be prepared to declare it over. I mean, the virus is going to become endemic, right? This idea that we can get rid of it completely, like they're trying to do in Australia, biologically impossible. Never going to happen, right? That's the bad news. The good news is that as viruses evolve, they become more infectious, like the Delta variant, but they become less deadly. They keep telling us about the case counts, maybe a little bit about the hospitalizations. Where are the death counts? Go look at the death curves over the last month, and then tell me if you're still that worried about the Delta variant, right? Be very wary of numbers that are being presented to you in the media without any context that helps you wrap your head around them. Otherwise, they're just bare statistics. 1,600 children have been hospitalized with COVID, not of COVID, with COVID right now. Well, how many total children are hospitalized with RSV right now around the United States? How many children are hospitalized, period? Do we know that? 300,000 people, whatever, died of COVID last year in the United States. Terrible, terrible. Look, I've seen how bad this illness can be. I do ethics consults in the hospital. I have sat with more families than I can count and had to explain to them that their loved one was irretrievably dying of this illness. I've seen the worst that it can do. I do not want to trivialize any one of the people who's lost their lives to this. But how many people died last year of cardiovascular disease? Twice the number of people that had COVID. Is anyone talking about coercively mandating a Mediterranean diet and daily exercise to bring those numbers down? That would be less invasive than an injection into your body that's being mandated. That would be less invasive and less coercive, right? So maybe you don't buy that argument, but the numbers have to have context, okay? If they present death counts without baseline death rates, without comparison to how many people are dying of other illnesses every year, there's a difference between making a plausible public health argument that everyone should be vaccinated, which is an argument that you can make. It's not a difficult argument to make. And going from there to, therefore, we can mandate coercively that everyone be vaccinated. The second proposition doesn't automatically follow from the first, but many people are behaving as though it does. I can make a plausible public health argument that we could save tens of thousands of lives every year. I know this with statistical certainty. I could save tens of thousands of lives every year of people prevent them from dying in motor vehicle accidents. I know exactly how to do it. Just lower the speed limit on all the interstates to 20 miles an hour. That would accomplish that purpose, right? Nobody here probably wants to do that. Are you all wishing or, you don't care about the death of all those people? No, of course not. There's just competing social goods at stake here. And we always have to strike a balance. We're taking calculated risks all the time. That doesn't mean we're killers. That doesn't mean we're heartless. That doesn't mean we lack empathy. We need to begin reasoning that way also about the pandemic, right? That doesn't mean I have answers about what the policy should be, but we have to begin putting our policies back into the kind of context from which we reason about other public goods. How are we doing for time? Maybe two more questions. All right. Scott.
I'd like to get back to the eugenics part, if we could. You said that the new eugenics is consumer-driven, and so it's largely something that we are volunteering to do, we're choosing to do rather than having it forced upon us. And given that the value of patient autonomy is so pervasive in the medical culture today, what hope do you have that we can come to a consensus on some reasonable limits on these enhancement therapies? I'll take that as a mic drop.
Once we cross certain thresholds, it's very hard to have a principled stopping point. So the slippery slope on certain issues is real because logic requires that we follow our premises out to their logical conclusions, right? We're free to choose our premises. We're free to choose our starting points and our principles. But then inexorably, they will play out over time to their logical conclusions. So I'm not seeing a lot of public will, either among professionals or scientists or bioethicists or politicians or regulators, to draw some hard and fast lines around germline gene editing, which has received cautious, let's move forward, but of course very carefully, is the international consensus right now. Or around issues of enhancement. Well, it's hard to define, and what counts as enhancement? Aren't eyeglasses a form of enhancement? I mean, this is kind of more or less the same thing, right? So right now, I'm not very optimistic. I worry that some of these technologies are going to have to come back to bite us and create problems on the individual or social level before we recognize. Much has happened with the ecological movement, right? Now people are interested in doing something about pollution and the climate and so forth. But we've moved very far down a certain road with certain technologies and certain ways of living, before we started feeling the effects of some of those things. And I worry that socially these technologies are actually going to play out in that way, that it's not going to be people with a lot of forethought thinking ahead and saying, no, we really don't want to go down that road. I think there's going to be a lot of social experiments, and we may have to feel the pain of some of them not going very well before we decide, no, we don't really want to do that anymore. Or at least we don't want to legally permit that anymore. I hope I'm wrong about that, but one more.
So let's talk about CRISPR, because you brought that up, and which I'm a biochemist and having worked in kidney disease for years, is you look at CRISPR and the potential it has to cure sickle cell or cystic fibrosis and editing those, and it's a miracle. I mean, because I've seen so much suffering in my life. But how do you stop all the other stuff that comes with it? Like you're talking about enhancements or letting rogue people start doing things that you don't want them to do. I don't know how you stop it. We've never, as a society, been able to stop the things we don't and let it only be used for good. I don't see that ever happening.
It's a really great question. And even looking at the history of eugenics, it's easy for us to sort of look back and say these people must have been, just incorrigible racists or control freaks or just really mean to certain people. Okay, there probably was that. But if you drill into the history, one of the really disturbing things that you start to learn is that most of these people had very good intentions. They were trying to solve real social problems. So the problem of mental illness before the 1950s, before we had the first antipsychotic medication, Thorazine, was a very serious social, it still is an enormous social problem, even with treatments that are somewhat better than what we had in the early 20th century. But how do we try to help these individuals live in society without self-destructing? How do we try to take care of them? Well, maybe if we can at least prevent them from having too many babies that they can't care for, that would do them some good. That would allow them some more freedom of movement and less confinement and so forth. So many of the eugenicists were social reformers that had good intentions. They wanted to help people, right? Psychiatrists, I think one of the reasons psychiatrists got sucked into the eugenics thing even more than other physicians is that we were 50 years behind the rest of medicine in new developments, and we really, really wanted to help people. So in the early 20th century, we had the advent of, late 19th century, the advent of anesthesiology for surgery, which was awesome, right? Imagine getting a mastectomy prior to anesthesia. Not fun, okay? Imagine getting your appendix out in the early 19th century prior to anesthesia. Not fun. We had the advent of antibiotics in the early 20th century. So internal medicine took a huge leap forward in terms of what we were able to treat. Psychiatry still didn't have good pharmacologic or other interventions for schizophrenia and manic depression and severe depression and so forth. And this notion that was presented as scientific regarding heritability, which obviously oversimplified how we inherit traits that put us at risk of mental illness. But nonetheless, there was this notion that maybe we can just get rid of these diseases entirely by breeding them out of the population, right? Which seems like a pretty definitive solution. Get rid of schizophrenia, get rid of manic depressive illness, have no more individuals that are afflicted by these things. That was a temptation for well-meaning people that wanted to help people who were suffering, right?
You're really lucky, Mom. I know.
So, I mean, I think we have to be wary of selfish intentions, but we even have to be cautious about good intentions, which can nonetheless take us in unexpected directions. And that's where, I mean, we need wisdom, and we need humility, and we need to draw on deep sources of moral wisdom that I think are in danger of being discarded today. And if the people in this room and the people that we know can start thinking about these issues in those terms, I think we have something to offer to a society that's very confused and is just going to operate on a basic principle that if something can be done, it should. And we have plenty of historical evidence as to where that principle will lead if we let it have free rein. So thank you all for coming.
Great pink hair. Thank you, Aaron.